Paul Zalkin, a partner in our restructuring team, interviews aviation experts from the Airline Management Group on the impact coronavirus has had on the sector. Peter Davies is the CEO of Airline Management Group. Ben Leon is Airline Management Group's Chief Commercial Officer. Augusto Viansson Ponte is Director of Strategy and Planning at Airline Management Group. Part 2. Airline Failure.
Will airlines fail? Will other airlines fail in the UK? And how do you think that process is best managed?
That's an important question. I think the repatriation is important, but I think repatriation happens over a very short time. Obviously, I want to try and get the people back. And the airline industry, in conjunction with the government, is doing a pretty good job, in my opinion, globally. I think the relevancy of your question is in the context of the airline industry. And here I have to be brutally honest. And that is, it's an odd industry in as much that all the CEOs and most of the senior management know each other in the competitive airlines, not because of competition, because I can assure you, it is a dog-eat-dog business. It's not very pleasant commercially. But we come together through the importance of not wanting to hurt anyone. So their safety is the paramount. So we have a lot of associations and organizations that are responsible, and we coordinate our safety through that. So that's one thing. But it will be argued by a lot of people, and we've got some colleagues, not just the two online, Augusto and Ben, but others, who will argue, and certainly people like Willie Walsh and others, will say, well, every cloud has a silver lining. And there's a strong argument that perhaps we have too much capacity and that consolidation is a necessary thing that we need to go through over the period of over the next few months, if not few years. The airline industry is its own worst enemy in many respects, aided and abetted, understandably, by the principal OEMs, Boeing and Airbus. And that is they're always seeking capacity, put more capacity on, put more capacity on. And when you put on more capacity, which is in excess of demand, which is normally the case, there's a separate argument for the low cost 20 years ago, which will be a separate debate one day. But today, not today, but a few weeks ago, there was far more capacity than there were people traveling. And the only way in which you encourage, again, from a consumer point of view, people coming on board the aircraft is to obviously enhance the product, to give all the best value, nice airports, executive clubs, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, it's the price that's going to make the significant difference. So the airlines themselves are being caught in a conundrum, in a vortex, if you like, whereby they've been trying to outdo each other. And they do that by lowering their revenues, and therefore that hits the bottom line. The airline industry is not very good at making money for shareholders. There are some good times at the moment. The United States has gone through a superb 5 or 6 years, but that was principally because of consolidation and one or two airlines going bust. So I think the airline industry itself has to look and do some navel gazing in terms of how is that going to manage itself to make sure that we don't end up chasing capacity again. Inevitably, if there's a lack of consumer demand, which I think there will be, then that will create a sort of level playing field. But I can bet you the bottom dollar that as soon as business starts to perk up and whenever, we'll go back to our old systems, which is an odd thing to say, but therefore there will be airline failures. The justification will be, is their particular model, is their particular network, type of aircraft they fly, relevant to what we think is going to happen in the marketplace, and how do they stack up against their own competition? That's without bringing in the complications of flag carriers and politicians and state aid in the EU and all the other ramifications of that.
And we've already had one of the major UK airlines calling for government assistance. The response so far from the Chancellor and from government has been state aid and bailouts will only be considered when you've been to your shareholders and when you have exhausted all other potential routes to raise capital. On the other hand, look at the US, where a $25 billion stimulus package has recently sort of been announced. for their airline sector. And, you know, their airline sector has been through some very, very turbulent times for an extended period. What are your thoughts on the requirements for there to be some intervention by the UK government in terms of financial stimulus and aid, not just for airlines, but for the sector generally?
Well, if I can answer first, I know Ben and Augusto have got some specific comments, but my view is a reiteration, if you like, of what I just said, in as much that airlines have to and do provide a strategic conduit. They provide the fastest and most safest means of getting from A to B on a global basis. So the need to be able to do that, even though there may be a significant change in the way in which we live, the modus operandi of individuals in the society that we're going to find ourselves in as we move forward, that fundamental requirement will still be there, of course. The question is, do the governments perceive that to be important from their country's perspective, or do they see the private sector, the commercialism, creating a level playing field where perhaps the airline industry will be reduced, but still provide the necessary capacity to satisfy the GDP of that country's requirements? Now, these are questions that the economists and the politicians need to answer. My feeling is that the airlines will react positively to, some airlines will act positively to sorting themselves out because they see that as opportunity if we're being the other companies to go bust, which is exactly what they want. So it is a dog-eat-dog business, but I think it's the balance between strategic conduit and the necessity to make sure that you keep your shareholders happy.
So Ben, I mean, you worked for British Airways in the earlier part of your career, and it is, I suppose, as near as the UK gets to having a flag carrier. It's obviously it's not a nationalised airline, but there is a sense that British Airways, for instance, is of strategic importance to the UK and is also part of our sort of national identity. How important is it to a country to sort of have a flag carrier, both from a sort of an economic point of view, a strategic point of view, but is there a sense that airlines are part of your national identity and it's important to support them for that reason?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Paul. The question of flag carriers and flag carrier status, and whether they're government owned or privately owned. I think the UK was one of the first countries to move from national flag carrier to privatization. And we've seen, and as a team, we've worked with a number of different flag carriers in different parts of the world who have maintained their government as their main shareholder. And the struggles that they have by having a government as a shareholder, it really does impede it impedes the nimbleness of decision making. Obviously, governments have got their own bureaucracy, and they've got their own mechanisms of decision making and approval and authorization processes. For working in sort of monopolistic industries, national health services, or whether it's roads, whether it's the electricity companies or things like that, where generally speaking, these are not fast-moving markets, then government, has played and can continue to play an important role. When government gets involved in running an airline, our experience is that the more they're involved, the less healthy the airline happens to be. And that's usually because of difficulty in being able to adapt to the market demands and market pressures, whether that's because employment is a key factor, whether that's because certain key routes are politically necessary, and so forth. So whether the flag carrier is government owned or not, your question is is the flag carrier important to an economy? And from that perspective, absolutely, a flag carrier is important for a country. It doesn't have to be nationally owned, government owned in terms of 100% government owned, but the flag of the country does actually form a ambassadorial role. It also forms very much in this global community that we live in. It's very much the outstretched arm of the country. For economies that are based on tourism, where their core GDP is based on tourism, then a flag carrier is critical to supporting the rest of the economy. And for those that are island nations, then of course there's the linking up with other communities, so to provide a socio-economic and cultural and political and economic benefit. So yes, flag carriers are important, and as Peter said, you know, the global industry is really a conduit for the global economy. I like to say that the airline industry is like the invisible plumbing of the world. We don't really take too much. We take it for granted when we turn the tap on, and in this country and in Western countries where the tap is on and we get, you know, clear, clean drinking water to drink. But we don't, and in the same way, we've taken it for granted we can hop on a flight to go and visit a cousin, go and visit a relative, attend a wedding or a funeral, to go for a job interview, to go for a business meeting, to find a supplier. All of these things we've taken for granted in our developed economies. When it's not there, it has a dramatic impact on our economy. So a flag carrier for some countries in particular is critically important to their economy. And even for a country the size and shape of the United Kingdom, we don't have just one carrier. Obviously, there are a number of UK carriers, but British Airways does carry the flag on its tail and has very much been a flag carrier. It's the ambassadorial and economic stimulus for a nation.
And I'm interested in that idea of
just to reiterate, like what Ben was saying, like in terms of like flag carriers around the world that have a successful operating model. I mean, like you can take, like for example, an Air New Zealand, whereby like the government still retains some ownership, but it has given like the management entirely like to a proper managerial team, proper management team that is executing properly. It's a successful airline, and still it is seen as a clear link with the two New Zealand islands, and it functions as a fantastic billboard for the country, carries millions of tourists in and out of the nation, and it's really connecting the nation to the world, being like an island nation for most of us, like at the other end of the world, and being like very, 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 very distant. And they did like an excellent work in terms of making it a profitable airline, but maintaining government ownership and being a true flag carrier. So it is perfectly possible.
And it's interesting. I mean, sorry, Peter. Go on.
Just add one thing to that. I mean, I agree with all that. I think there's two words which are fundamentally important, which I've been involved in with my colleagues in national flag carriers. One is the value of the brand. And one should never underestimate the value of the brand, not just for the airline, but for the country. And the second point, one of the things that we continually do in turnarounds, the brand becomes the totem pole, the vanguard, the inspirational edict that you look up to. And often you find, and what we certainly do when we transform and restructure an airline, is take the values of the country and replicate those through the values of the airline. And therefore that resonates with not just the staff, which are fundamentally important in terms of delivering the capability of the product, but also there's a subconscious, there's a subliminal impact on the passengers, not just from their own country, but also from those people who are traveling to and from that country. People like Air France are classic. I mean, Air France is probably the most nationalistic. French people tend to travel air fronts, almost no question. Not all British people travel British Airways, but there is a significant importance in the brand and the values that brand represents of the airline itself and of the country.
So looking specific.
I was going to say, added to what Peter said, I mean, KLM as an example with its Dutch brand, you know, all airlines have been looking at cutting the weight of travel and all the items that they put on board in order to reduce the fuel burn, in order to reduce the expense in terms of the fuel cost, and also to reduce the emissions. But one of the items that KLM said they will never ever touch is the Delft houses that they offer in their premium cabins. Now, those are very pretty weighty items to carry on board, but they are so much part of the brand because they are so much deeply embedded in the Dutch heritage and culture, that is one thing that even if the economics of carrying that weight would decry one way, the brand and what it represents for the essence of what KLM stands for is it's absolutely a no-no not to take them on board.
I agree.
So Peter, looking at some of the specific, I mean, you know, you've been involved, in fact, all of you have been involved in the turnaround of some well-known carriers. I mean, I know most recently, Peter, you were the Chief Restructuring Officer for South African Airlines. Prior to that, you were working on Air Malta. Both nations, very different countries, but quite clearly their national airline was very important to their national identity. They're both big tourist destinations. So in terms of that sort of cultural piece and taking that brand, I mean, what were the sort of specific things you had to look at, you know, say for Air Malta and then for South African in terms of maintaining, enhancing and building that brand?
Well, there's an element of consistency, particularly amongst government-owned organisations, and that is they're often treated in the past, and one of the reasons why they get themselves into trouble is because two or three reasons. One is they think they're a government department, whereas they're not, they're a commercial airline. So therefore, the Department of Electricity, the Department of Health, the Department of Roads don't have any competition. The airline does. And when you've got a bunch of civil servants managing that, they have little concept of what's happening in the real world. And if you dive into the airline industry, you are diving into a significant pool of quite aggressive people. So there's an underlying misunderstanding about the business. They're often over managed in terms of too many people. They see that perhaps as an outlet for putting people into the organisation. But the fundamental and the liquidity in the balance sheet all sort of follows suit. In all these turnarounds and others, the hardwiring, the understanding of what the model looked like and what we can change it to, it's not that difficult. That sounds ostentatious. I don't mean it. They're standard models. It's a question of then how do you, what are the key performance factors in terms of making those changes? At the end of the day, the fundamental error that most of these airlines and indeed a lot of companies make is that without realizing that the single biggest competitor to that organization is the organization themselves and not the external competition. Because of whatever, arrogance or misunderstanding or whatever the reasons for that. So therefore one has to look inside to create those turnarounds. And you can create the right model, you can do all your network computations, you can calculate what are the right aircraft, etc., etc. What's often missing is a lack of management expertise. And here I cite particularly middle management. In all the organizations I've over many years now, when I've seen or had to change, the senior management's probably gone anyway. The grassroots are still there. It's the middle management that holds the strategic communications conduit. They can play with that mischievously, they can be positive, they can be negative. And therefore, what we tend to do is to bypass middle management and go straight to the bottom through the unions, but also direct to the staff and create a sense of importance, making them understand that we're there to try and understand how they do their job, because they do their job at the end of the day better than anyone else. So it's really the softer wiring, the softer elements of management, which we find to be the fundamental problem. The basic model is probably wrong, but creating the new model is not that difficult. Once you understand what the shareholders' objectives are, what can be done, and the geography is irrelevant in that sense. It's then creating that change. One has to become a disruptor. It's quite tough, but I have to say that of all the airline turnarounds, I think we've done 5, and I did some in DHL and KLM before that. At the end of the day, we've always been able to pull our people through, lead them through, create inspiration into a new environment, because at last someone's talking to them about flying aeroplanes from A to B and trying to make a profit, as opposed to, this is a government department, you can't do this, you can't do that, because I've got to go through 10 bureaucracies. Business doesn't work that way. If it does, it doesn't last very long. So these airlines, government supported, have been stacked up and supported by bureaucracy, and we have to cut that through.
Augusto, just one last sort of question to you. As a strategist, going back to the prospect of there being a failure, a UK airline failure, to what extent would the capacity of that failed airline, assuming it was one of the major airlines, to what extent do you think that would be picked up by the remaining airlines operating out of the UK? Would they jump at the opportunity to acquire those slots, acquire those routes, or is it likely to be the opposite of that?
No, I mean, the industry is usually very, very quick in picking these things up. I mean, especially here, like in the UK, like where a lot of like valuable routes would be would then become available. I mean, you would see an immediate reaction from the rest of the industry, just like really like coming and picking up like the pieces as soon as available, and that would be true like for domestic-based carriers in certain routes in certain markets, but also other international ones that would be in a position to do so. So generally, like when airlines fail, we have seen a very, very quick, if not immediate, replacement of the capacity by somebody else.
And so to sort of really close off this part of the conversation, look, there is inevitably the threat of an airline insolvency in the UK, as we were talking about earlier. We saw Flybe quite recently, and there's nothing to say that there couldn't be another airline insolvency. Bad for the shareholders, obviously. Bad in the immediate short term for the travelling public. Bad for the exchequer if they've got to pick up the cost of repatriation, but ultimately for the customer and for the industry, the capacity won't be lost, and the passenger will still maintain the opportunity to benefit from those huge route networks. So it's all about the short term, really.
Yeah, let's say that it's the typical market, the laws of the market that would eventually prevail. If there are interesting routes, if there is sufficient demand, somebody will pick it up and fly it in a proper commercial way. If it doesn't, because there is overcapacity and so on, the market will adjust accordingly.
Absolutely.
But often, being the least competitive or the least profitable airlines that would fail, the consequence is that inevitably somebody with a lower cost base or a more efficient way of flying will eventually pick up that capacity, and in fact will run it profitable, whereas the incumbent wasn't. So
the industry
consumer in the end, in the longer term, medium to longer term, there would be that more effect.
Okay, interesting.
In part 3, Paul Zalkin and his guest will discuss the aviation industry supply chain. You can watch this on the Quantuma and Airline Management Group's websites and LinkedIn channels. Thank you for watching this episode. For further information, you can contact Paul Zalkin and Quantuma via the links below this film.